It's hard to tell this story even now. It still sends chills down my spine when I think about that Christmas Eve. Everything started out so perfectly ordinary. Snow was falling softly outside, the kids were laughing, and we had all gathered in the living room with hot cocoa, the smell of gingerbread and pine filling the house. I remember thinking how perfect it was. And then, the knock came. At first it was faint, almost like the wind brushing against the door. I ignored it, but it came again. Louder this time. Deliberate. My husband Rob went to check, assuming it was a neighbor or maybe a late caroler. But when he opened the door, it wasn't what we expected. Standing there was a woman, her face shadowed by a tattered red hood. She clutched a single dripping candle in her gloved hands, its flame barely flickering in the winter breeze. Her voice was soft but unnervingly melodic as she began to sing. It wasn't any Christmas carol I recognized, and the tune made my stomach turn for reasons I couldn't explain. "Thank you, but we're not interested," Rob said politely, stepping back as if to shut the door. Her hand shot out, pressing against the frame. Her nails, I'll never forget them, were unnaturally long and sharp. She tilted her head, her face finally catching the glow of the candle. Her eyes, they were hollow as if the flame wasn't reflecting in them. Rob didn't say another word, just shut the door with a forceful shove. We tried to laugh it off, joked that we'd just had our first creepy caroler experience, but something about her unsettled me deeply. The kids went back to their movie, and Rob assured me it was fine. But then Ellie, our youngest, tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, she's in the backyard." My stomach sank. "What do you mean, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ellie pointed toward the glass doors leading to the patio. I didn't want to look, but I had to, and there she was. The woman in the red hood stood at the edge of the yard, barely visible through the snow. She wasn't singing anymore, just standing there, holding her candle, watching. Rob turned on the patio light and stepped outside, yelling at her to leave. The light flickered twice and then went out completely. When it came back on, she was gone, but her footprints remained in the snow, leading toward the woods behind our house. I wanted to call the police, but Rob insisted she was just some crazy person and that she'd left. I wasn't so sure, and soon I had every reason to be afraid. The house began to feel wrong. The Christmas lights dimmed until only the faintest glow remained. The television crackled with static, then started showing flashes of a snowy forest, images of trees twisting unnaturally in the wind. Ellie screamed, pointing to the screen, where the woman's face briefly appeared before the power cut out entirely. Rob grabbed a flashlight and muttered something about checking the breaker box. I begged him not to go, but he kissed my forehead and said he'd be right back. The silence after he left was suffocating. Then the knock came again. This time, it was at the back door. The kids huddled close to me, and I held them tightly, whispering reassurances I didn't believe myself. I didn't dare move, didn't dare look. When Rob came back, his face was pale. "I followed the footprints," he whispered. "They lead to something." "What do you mean something?" I demanded. "There's an old chapel in the woods. I've never seen it before. I think she's from there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "We have to call someone," I stammered, but my words were drowned out by the sound of faint singing drifting through the house. It was coming from upstairs. I still don't know how I found the courage, but I crept upstairs with Rob, flashlight in hand. The singing grew louder as we reached the children's bedroom. Inside, Ellie's dollhouse was lit up, as if by tiny candles. The woman's voice spilled out of it, warped and echoing, as the little plastic figures inside turned their heads to face us. Rob smashed the dollhouse with his boot, and the singing stopped abruptly. The house fell silent. We didn't sleep that night. By morning, the footprints in the snow had vanished, and the chapel Rob claimed to have seen was nowhere to be found. But I swear to you, every Christmas Eve since, we hear faint knocking on our door and the ghostly echo of a song I wish I could forget. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas retreat. After a tough year, I decided to rent a remote cabin to spend the holiday season alone. I envisioned cozy nights by the fire, snow falling gently outside, and the kind of peace you only find far from the noise of the world. When I arrived, the cabin was everything I imagined. A small wooden haven surrounded by dense, snow-covered pines, tucked far away from anyone or anything. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away. The first few days were blissful. The silence of the woods was calming, and the crackling fireplace was the only sound in the evenings. On Christmas Eve, the snowstorm started. Heavy flakes poured down relentlessly, shrouding the forest in white. I stayed inside, sipping cocoa and reading an old book I'd brought along. The wind outside howled, but it only added to the cozy isolation I'd wanted. As night fell, the storm grew fiercer. The wind pounded against the cabin, and the trees swayed violently in the gale. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint knocking at the front door. At first, I dismissed it as the wind. Who would be out here, miles away from civilization, in weather like this? The knocking came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I approached the door. I peered through the small frosted window, but all I could see was the swirling snow. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response, just the sound of the storm raging outside. Cautiously, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The icy wind immediately bit at my face, and I squinted into the darkness. Nothing. No one. The snow around the porch was undisturbed, pristine. Shivering, I closed and locked the door tightly, telling myself it was just my imagination. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and the wind sounded almost like whispers at times. When morning came, I felt foolish for being so spooked. The storm had eased, leaving the landscape buried under a thick blanket of snow. I decided to take a short walk to clear my head, but as I stepped outside, I froze. There in the fresh snow were footprints leading up to the cabin, bare footprints, human unmistakably, and they stopped right at the front door. The hair on my neck stood on end. I had been awake all night. I would have heard someone approach. My pulse quickened as I followed the tracks, but they ended abruptly a few feet away from the cabin. No trail leading away, no sign of where they could have gone. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had vanished into thin air. I hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. I avoided the windows, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. When night fell, the sense of unease grew unbearable. I kept the lights on, the fire roaring, but the shadows seemed to creep closer anyway. Then around midnight, it started again, the knocking. This time, it was more insistent, louder. It wasn't just at the front door, it was coming from the back door too, in the windows. A frantic, uneven pounding that echoed through the cabin. My chest tightened as I grabbed a fireplace poker and approached the front door. Through the frosted glass, I could just barely make out a figure standing there. I don't know what possessed me to open the door, but I did. The figure, a man, stood motionless, staring at me. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, lifeless. He wasn't wearing a coat or shoes, just tattered clothes that didn't belong in this century. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Paralyzed, I stared back at him, my breath visible in the icy air. Then, without warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. The snow beneath his feet didn't crunch. It was as if he wasn't truly there. I slammed the door and locked it, trembling. I thought the worst was over, but I was wrong. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed across the wooden floor. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in bed, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my flashlight and flung the door open. The hallway was empty. The air was freezing, my breath misting in front of me. On the floor, leading away from my room, were wet footprints. I followed them to the living room, where they stopped abruptly in front of the fireplace. The fire had gone out, but something was there, a single charred handprint on the mantelpiece. I bolted out of the cabin that night, not caring about the storm or the cold. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I returned with the cabin owner a few days later, the place was just as I had left it, except for one thing. Above the fireplace, etched into the wood, were the words, "You let me in."